They said he built empires with a whisper. Alistair Croft, the man whose face was a granite fixture on the covers of his own magazines, whose voice could make stock markets tremble and politicians grovel. They said his wife Genevieve was the architect of their perfect life, a woman so polished she seemed to have been carved from ice and moonlight. They said many things about the Crofts, but they never said anything about me, because I wasn't supposed to exist. I was Cora. For 5 years, I was the silent ghost in their machine, the nanny who raised their children in a gilded cage overlooking the city, and they fired me because my mother had the audacity to die. They told me over the phone the day before the service. It wasn't even a call, it was a text from Genevieve's personal assistant. Your request for bereavement leave is inconveniently timed, a major gala. She told me to reconsider. I didn't. I flew home, buried my mother with a handful of grieving relatives in a windswept cemetery that smelled of rain and real earth, and flew back the next day with a hole in my heart so vast, I felt like the wind was whistling through me. I returned to find my 2 suitcases packed and waiting by the service elevator. Genevieve was standing there, her arms crossed, her expression one of deep personal offense. She said, "We require absolute reliability, Cora. This instability is not something we can have around the children." Instability. The word hung in the sterile, climate-controlled air between us. The instability of a daughter mourning her mother. She handed me an envelope, a severance check that amounted to less than one of her monthly shoe budgets. And 5 years of my life, of raising her children, of being the constant stable fixture in their chaotic high-powered lives, were erased with a flick of her wrist. I was no longer a person, I was a solved problem. But they didn't know about the journal. They didn't know about story time. For 3 of those 5 years, their youngest son, Leo, had been telling me bedtime stories. Not about dragons or wizards, but about Daddy's special meetings in the locked study. Innocent, detailed accounts, recited with a child's perfect memory. He'd tell me about the grumpy men from the government who came after dark, about the magic papers that made Daddy smile, about the angry phone calls where Daddy used names I would later see smeared across the headlines of his own newspapers. And I wrote it all down, every name, every date, every story, in a simple leather-bound journal I called Story Time. They thought I was a ghost. They were about to learn that ghosts can haunt you, and if you've ever been made to feel invisible, if you've ever been dismissed when you deserved respect, then you know the quiet fire that moment lit in me. Stick with me, and I'll tell you how I used their secrets to burn their perfect world to the ground. Let me know in the comments if you've ever had a boss who treated you like a piece of furniture. It really does help to know you're not alone. The door to the penthouse slid shut with a well-oiled hiss, a sound that had been the punctuation mark to my days for half a decade. Now it was a final sentence, a full stop. The polished marble lobby, usually a place of silent, indifferent transit, felt like a stage. The doorman, a man I'd greeted twice a day for 5 years, suddenly couldn't meet my eyes. He was already practicing my non-existence. I walked out onto the street. The cold November air a slap in the face. The city lights of Manhattan blurred into a cruel, glittering smear. I hailed a cab, the first one that would stop, and gave the driver the address of a cheap weekly rate hotel I'd found online. It was all I could afford. My 2 suitcases, containing the sum total of a life lived in the service of others, were my only companions. The hotel room was a shoebox. It smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a chemical cocktail of transient despair. The window looked out onto a brick wall. This was the stark, brutal reality, after living in a palace in the sky. I dropped the suitcases on the floor, the thud echoing in the tiny space. I didn't unpack. What was the point? I sank onto the edge of the bed, the mattress groaning under my weight. And that's when it hit me. The dam of composure I had so carefully constructed in front of Genevieve, the professional mask I had worn for 5 years, it didn't just crack, it shattered. A sob tore its way out of my chest, a raw animal sound that I didn't recognize as my own. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated loss. Not just for my mother, not just for my job. It was the loss of a part of myself I had given away for free. I had poured my soul into those children, into Leo and his older sister Maya. I had been their rock, their constant. I taught them to tie their shoes. I held them when they had nightmares. I celebrated their birthdays with more genuine joy than their own parents ever mustered. I had loved them, and for that love, for that devotion, I was discarded like a broken toy. The grief for my mother, a sharp, clean pain, was now tangled with the ugly, humiliating poison of being fired. The two emotions swirled together, creating a vortex of misery that threatened to swallow me whole. I cried until my eyes were swollen shut, until my throat was raw, until there was nothing left but a hollow, aching silence. I lay there for hours, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the city's muted roar a distant reminder of a world that was moving on without me. And in that silence the past began to unspool. It wasn't a choice, it was an avalanche of memories, each one a small cut, a tiny betrayal that I had ignored or explained away at the time. I remembered my first day 5 years ago. I was so full of hope. A small-town girl with a degree in child development, landing a job with one of the most powerful families in New York. I thought I had made it. I walked into that penthouse, all glass and steel and minimalist art, and I was intimidated but also thrilled. Genevieve had given me a tour, her words clipped and precise. She didn't point out the playrooms, she pointed out the security cameras. She didn't talk about the children's favorite foods. She handed me a laminated schedule of their approved dietary restrictions. She spoke to me while looking at a spot on the wall just over my shoulder. It was the first time I felt it, the subtle dehumanizing act of being looked through, not at. I told myself it was just her way. Rich people are different. I thought I was there to do a job, not to make friends. That first year was a lesson in invisibility. Alistair would walk into a room where I was playing with Leo, his eyes sweeping over us as if we were a piece of furniture he was vaguely displeased with. He'd pick up his phone, bark orders into it, and walk out, never once acknowledging my presence or his son's. He called me the help when he thought I couldn't hear. Genevieve was worse, in a way. Her cruelty was quiet, insidious. She'd leave lists of my deficiencies on the kitchen counter. Cora failed to sanitize the play blocks on schedule. Cora allowed Leo's screen time to exceed the allotted 30 minutes by 90 seconds. Cora's uniform is not pressed to standard. Each note was a tiny paper cut to my soul. I endured it for the children. Maya was quiet and withdrawn, already learning to mimic her mother's icy composure. But Leo was different. He was a spark of warmth in that cold, sterile world. He was curious and bright, and full of a boundless, innocent love that his parents had no idea how to receive. He attached himself to me, his small hand always finding mine. I was his safe harbor, and that, I told myself, was worth the price of my own dignity. It was a lie, of course, a dangerous, self-deceiving lie. It's so easy to justify your own subjugation when you frame it as a noble sacrifice. That was the logic I used. Debatable, I know, but it was the only thing that got me through the day. Then came story time. It started about 2 years in. Leo was 5. He resisted bedtime, like most kids. So I invented a ritual. I would sit on the edge of his bed, and he would tell me a story. At first it was about his day at his elite private school, or a funny dream he'd had. But then the stories began to change. One night, he was very serious. He whispered, "Daddy had a special meeting tonight, Cora. A man named Mr. Sterling came. Daddy was mad. Daddy said Mr. Sterling's newspaper was being bad. He told him to be a good boy, or he'd be put in a timeout." I smiled, thinking it was a child's interpretation of a business disagreement. I wrote it down in a little notebook I kept, mostly to track his developmental milestones. I titled the entry Story Time. Mr. Sterling, A week later, I saw the headline on a news tablet left on the counter. Sterling Media Group CEO ousted by board in surprise vote. My blood ran cold. That was the turning point. I bought a proper journal, a sturdy one with a leather cover, and I started listening. Really listening. Leo's stories became my secret obsession. They were a child's unfiltered, unvarnished truth, spoken without an understanding of their gravity. He'd tell me about Mr. Senator, who came for dinner and left with a big fat envelope of pictures. He told me about a woman named Miss Anya, from the government, who cried in Daddy's study after he showed her something on his computer. He told me about a plan to buy a small TV station, and how Daddy laughed and said, "We'll let them think it's for the news, but it's really for our friends in Albany." He had a child's gift for remembering specific strange details, the way one man's watch was shiny like a spider's eye, or how another smelled like old rain. He'd give me dates, because the meetings often coincided with events he remembered, like the day we had the big fireworks, or right after my birthday party. I wrote it all down, every last word, my hand shaking as I transcribed the innocent babble that I knew was a map to a world of corruption and power. This wasn't about revenge. Not yet. It was about survival. It was a life raft of knowledge in an ocean of dismissiveness. It was proof that I saw them, even if they refused to see me. My only other potential ally in that house of mirrors was Marcus, the head of the Crofts' personal security team. He was a former NYPD detective, a man with quiet eyes that missed nothing. He was built like a retired linebacker, but he moved with a stillness that was unnerving. He was as much a fixture as I was, but he was a different kind of invisible. He was the invisible wall, the silent threat. We rarely spoke, but we had an understanding. We were the two sane people in the asylum. I remember one morning, Genevieve had gone on a tirade because a caterer had used the wrong kind of artisanal olive oil for her luncheon. Her voice was like shards of glass. I was in the kitchen trying to stay out of the line of fire, my knuckles white as I gripped the counter. After she swept out, Marcus walked in. He didn't say a word. He just poured a cup of coffee from his own personal thermos, a rich dark brew, nothing like the watery bitter sludge from the staff machine, and slid it across the counter to me. He just nodded, a brief, almost imperceptible dip of his chin, and walked away. It was a small gesture, but in that house, it was an act of rebellion. It was an acknowledgement. He saw me. That small kindness forged a bond of silent solidarity between us, a bond I hadn't realized I would one day need to call upon. Lying in that grimy hotel bed, the memory of that coffee was a small point of light in the darkness. The full weight of 5 years of slights, of being overlooked, of swallowing my pride, came crashing down. The final insult of being fired for burying my mother was not an isolated incident. It was the logical conclusion of 1,000 tiny dehumanizations. It was the period at the end of a long, painful sentence. A wave of cold clarity washed over me, extinguishing the fire of my grief, and leaving behind something hard and sharp, like ice. My mother's face swam into my vision. She had been a union organizer at a textile factory, a woman who fought tooth and nail for people who were treated as disposable. I could hear her voice, as clear as if she were in the room with me. "Don't you ever let them make you feel small, Cora. Your worth isn't determined by their price tag." I sat up, the bed springs screaming in protest. I swung my legs over the side and walked to my suitcase. I unzipped the front pocket and pulled out the journal. Story time. I held it in my hands. It felt heavy, dense with secrets. The leather was cool and smooth against my skin. This wasn't just a collection of a child's stories anymore. It was a weapon. It was a key. It was a testament. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that this was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of theirs. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. It was about taking the narrative they had forced upon me and writing a new ending, my ending. The first step was to move beyond raw emotion and into the cold, clear realm of strategy. The journal was a treasure map, but a map is useless if you don't know how to read it. I spent the next 2 days in that suffocating hotel room, turning it into a makeshift war room. I used the small wobbly desk as my command center. I bought a cheap laptop and a burner phone with the cash I had on hand. My first act of defiance was cashing Genevieve's insulting severance check. The money felt dirty, but it was a resource. It was fuel, and I would use it to burn them. I opened the Storytime journal and began a process that was part forensic accounting, part intelligence analysis. For years, I hadn't just been writing down Leo's stories, I had been quietly, obsessively corroborating them. Whenever he mentioned a name or a company, I would use the brief moments of downtime I had, while the children were napping or after they were asleep for the night, to conduct my own research on the staff computers, always careful to erase my history. I had a second, encrypted USB drive, a tiny sliver of metal and plastic that I kept hidden in the lining of my purse. On it was a shadow ledger. It contained timelines, news articles, flight records I could find publicly, and corporate filings that matched the dates and subjects of Leo's stories. Leo would tell me about a sad man from a sunshine company who visited his father on a Tuesday in March. My research would uncover that the CEO of a major solar energy firm, a competitor to one of Alistair's holdings, had his company's stock mysteriously plummet that week after a negative story, sourced from an anonymous insider, appeared in one of Alistair's flagship newspapers. The journal was the heart, but my encrypted drive was the brain. It was the connective tissue that turned a child's anecdotes into a pattern of conspiracy. I wasn't just a nanny, I had unknowingly been training myself as an investigative archivist. My foresight hadn't been a conscious plan for revenge. It was a defense mechanism. It was a way to prove to myself that I wasn't crazy, that the darkness I felt in that house was real. Now it was my arsenal. Once I had the information organized, I knew my next move couldn't be a frontal assault. Going to the press with a nanny's diary, even with my research, was a fool's errand. They would shred me. Alistair Croft owned half the media in the city. He could kill the story and my reputation in a single news cycle. I would be painted as a disgruntled, hysterical, money-grubbing liar. Leo's innocence would be weaponized against me, and I couldn't bear that. The plan had to be surgical. It had to come from the inside, and that meant I needed an ally. I needed Marcus. Contacting him was a massive risk. He was still on their payroll. His loyalty, despite that single cup of coffee, was ultimately to the people who signed his checks. But my gut, the same gut that told me to start writing in the journal, told me he was the only way. I couldn't call his work phone. It would be monitored. I couldn't email him. I had to find another way. I remembered him mentioning once, in a rare brief conversation, that he volunteered on weekends at a dog shelter in the Bronx. He was trying to socialize retired police dogs. It was a small detail, something I had filed away without thinking. Now it was my only lead. I took a subway ride that felt like a journey to another country, the polished steel of Midtown giving way to the gritty reality of the outer boroughs. I found the shelter. It was a loud, chaotic place, filled with the smell of disinfectant and the sound of barking. And there he was, in a quiet corner of an outdoor run, sitting patiently with a large German shepherd that had the haunted eyes of a combat veteran. He was wearing a simple t-shirt and jeans, the armor of his security uniform gone. He looked more human than I had ever seen him. He saw me approach, and his face registered a flicker of surprise, quickly masked by his professional calm. He stood up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Cora," he said. His voice was low. "What are you doing here?" I kept my distance. I held up the burner phone. "I need to talk to you, Marcus." "Not here. Somewhere safe." His eyes, trained to read threats, scanned my face. He saw the desperation, but he also saw the resolve. He gave me a short nod. He wrote down a time and an address on a scrap of paper. "A coffee shop in Queens. Tomorrow. Don't be late," he said, "and don't be followed." The next 24 hours were agonizing. I barely slept. I kept replaying the scene in my head. What if it was a trap? What if he was just luring me in to report me to Alistair? It was a gamble, but it was the only move on the board. I showed up at the coffee shop, a nondescript place tucked away on a side street, exactly at the appointed time. He was already there,
at a small table in the back corner, facing the door. The cop in him never slept. He had 2 coffees waiting. I sat down, my heart pounding. He pushed one of the cups toward me. Talk, he said. I didn't show him the journal. That was my trump card, and I wasn't playing it yet. Instead, I started with the truth. I told him about being fired, about the funeral, about the reason. I watched his face. A muscle twitched in his jaw. It was the only sign of emotion. Then I chose my words carefully. I told him that during my time there, I had become aware of certain irregularities, meetings, conversations, things that a man with his background would understand were not just business. I told him I had kept records. He was silent for a long time, just stirring his coffee, the spoon clinking softly against the ceramic. I thought I had failed. Then he looked up, his eyes meeting mine directly for the first time. He said, I was a detective for 15 years. I thought I'd seen it all. Corruption, greed. But this place, this family, it's a different level. It's clean, it's sanitized. There's no blood, just spreadsheets and shell companies. But it's rotten to the core. He then told me his story. He told me about a young journalist, a kid really, who had gotten too close to one of Alistair's political dealings. The kid didn't even publish the story. He just started asking the right questions. Alistair found out. He didn't threaten the kid. He didn't sue him. He just made a few calls. The kid's father, a factory foreman in Ohio, was suddenly laid off. His sister lost her college scholarship. His landlord initiated eviction proceedings for a minor fabricated lease violation. They didn't crush the journalist. They crushed his entire world, systemically and silently, until he had no choice but to give up and disappear. Marcus had been tasked with the background research on the family. He said it was the moment he realized he wasn't in security anymore. He was a gangster's muscle, just with better tailoring. That was his line. That was the moment his loyalty to Alistair died. He just hadn't had a way out. Until now. He leaned forward. What do you have, Cora? And what do you want? I want accountability, I said, and I need your help to get it. I need to know the layout of the study, the security protocols, the server backups. I need to know where the bodies are buried, digitally speaking. He nodded slowly. You're playing a dangerous game. I know, I said, but I'm not the one who has anything left to lose. He agreed. He would be my insider, my ghost in their machine. We set up a protocol for communication, using the burner phones, dead drops for physical items, code words. It felt like something out of a spy movie, but this was our reality now. My final piece of the puzzle was legal counsel. I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone brilliant, ruthless, and most importantly, someone who understood the unique intersection of media law, corporate malfeasance, and whistleblower protection. I took my meager savings, the inheritance from my mother, a son that felt sacred, and the severance check, and I found her, Anya Sharma. Her firm was small, a boutique operation that specialized in taking on giants. Her reputation preceded her. She was a shark who smiled like a saint. Our first meeting was in her small, cluttered office that smelled of old books and strong tea. I laid it all out. The journal, the USB drive, the story of Leo. Anya listened without interruption, her face unreadable. When I finished, she steepled her fingers and looked at me. She said, the journal is legally useless as direct evidence. It's hearsay from a minor. Using it in court would be brutal for the child, and we'd lose. My heart sank, but she continued, a slow smile spreading across her face. It's the most beautiful roadmap I have ever seen. This doesn't go to a courtroom, not at first. It goes to a journalist, a very specific journalist, and it goes to the board of directors. We don't detonate a bomb, Cora. We plant a seed of doubt and watch it grow into a forest of panic. She explained the strategy. We would use the journal, not as a weapon itself, but as a targeting system. We would find the weakest points in Alistair's armor, the points of highest leverage, and apply precise, unbearable pressure. She also explained the legal protections for me. We would structure this as a whistleblower complaint to the SEC on some of the financial matters, which would offer me a shield against retaliation and a potential reward. This is where I think she might have been bending the truth a little, making the protections sound more ironclad than they were in reality. But at that moment, Her confidence was exactly what I needed to hear. She was transforming my desperate gamble into a calculated strategic campaign. She saw the value in what I had, and in doing so she validated my own worth. For the first time since I'd walked out of that penthouse, I felt a flicker of real hope. The plan was no longer a secret, it was a conspiracy, and it was time to make our first move. The first move had to be silent, precise, and utterly terrifying for its target. Anya's philosophy was clear. You don't start a war with a cannon blast, when a single well-aimed sniper bullet will do. A public expose was the end game, not the opening gambit. The initial strike had to be internal, designed to create chaos and paranoia within Alistair Croft's inner circle. We needed to make him feel a chill, a sudden inexplicable drop in temperature in his perfectly climate-controlled world. We needed him to start chasing ghosts. We spent a full day poring over my journal and the encrypted drive, cross-referencing Leo's innocent stories with the cold, hard data of the outside world. We were looking for the perfect entry point. It couldn't be the biggest secret. That was for later. It had to be something small, something esoteric, something only a handful of people could possibly know. It had to be a detail so specific that its appearance in the wild would be like finding a single marked grain of sand on a vast beach. We found it in an entry from 18 months prior. Leo had described a late-night meeting with the angry pretzel man. His name, I had later researched, was Klaus Richter, the CEO of a German manufacturing conglomerate. According to Leo's story, Richter was there to finalize a friendly merger with one of Alistair's smaller tech companies, but Alistair had laughed at him. Leo quoted his father perfectly, the way a child mimics an adult's tone without understanding the words. He said, "Daddy told the pretzel man, the deal is dead, Klaus. My friends at the commission found a little problem with your import filings. A big, expensive problem, but maybe it goes away if you sell me your distribution network instead, for a discount." It was classic Alistair, not just a negotiation, but a kneecapping. The merger never happened. Richter's company suffered a massive unexplained regulatory fine. A month later, and Alistair's holding company acquired their North American distribution network for pennies on the dollar 6 months after that. The whole affair was buried in the business pages, a non-story. But it was our bullet. Anya drafted the email. It was a work of art in its brutal simplicity. It wasn't addressed to Alistair. Was addressed to every single member of the board of directors of Croft Global Media, sent from an encrypted anonymous email service routed through 3 different countries. The email contained no threats, no accusations. It was just one sentence, a question. Could the board clarify if the acquisition of the Richter distribution network was negotiated before or after the European Commission's import ruling was privately communicated to Mr. Croft? That was it. No signature, no follow-up. Just a single poisoned dart fired into the heart of their boardroom. We sent it at 3 a.m. New York time. Then we waited. The silence lasted for 48 hours. It was the most nerve-wracking 2 days of my life. I paced my new, slightly less depressing rental apartment, a small 1-bedroom I'd secured with my remaining funds. I checked the burner phone every 5 minutes. Nothing. I started to think we had miscalculated, that the email had been dismissed as spam, or that the board was so loyal to Alistair they had simply deleted it. I was wrong. The silence wasn't inaction. It was the deep breath before the explosion. On the 3rd morning, my burner phone buzzed. It was Marcus. His voice was low and tight. "It's happening," he said. He sounded almost impressed. "What's happening?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. "Pandemonium," he said. "Absolute 5-alarm pandemonium." He painted a picture for me. Alistair had convened an emergency, all hands on deck meeting with his senior legal and security teams. Marcus was there, standing silently against the wall, his face a mask of professional indifference. The boardroom, usually a place of smug calm, was electric with panic. Alistair was incandescent with rage. He was pacing back and forth, his face a mottled red. He was screaming that there was a traitor, a snake in his house. He held a printout of our email, waving it like a weapon. "Who sent this?" he roared. Who knows about this? Marcus told me the board was in full panic mode. They had started asking questions, quietly at first, then more insistently. They were corporate animals. They could smell the blood of a wounded predator. The Richter deal was a footnote, but the implication of the email, that Alistair was using government connections for insider trading and corporate extortion, was a potential company-killing scandal. Their stock options were flashing before their eyes. The paranoia was palpable. Alistair immediately assumed the leak came from the German side, from Klaus Richter himself, seeking revenge. He had his legal team drafting lawsuits. Then he changed his mind and decided it must be a rival. He was lashing out in every direction, his usual cold calculation replaced by a wild, unfocused fury. But never, not once, did his suspicion fall on the quiet, invisible nanny he had just fired. I was beneath his notice. My erasure was now my greatest asset. My name is Brielle, and for the last 12 years, I was the executive assistant to one of the most ruthless CEOs in the city. If you're watching this, it's probably because you've been there too. You've been the one holding it all together, the one they can't live without, right up until the moment they decide they can. So if you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been erased, do me a favor and hit that like button so I know I'm not just screaming into the void here. It helps to know you're not alone. He called me his human calendar, his external hard drive, his firewall. To Alistair Finch, I wasn't a person, I was a function, a utility. I managed every second of his life, from the brand of stevia in his morning coffee to the multi-billion-dollar acquisition meetings he only ever attended because my system of reminders, alarms, and pre-briefings made it physically impossible for him to miss them. I was the architect of his punctuality, the ghostwriter of his preparedness. He was the face on the magazine covers, the titan of I was the quiet hum of the servers in the background, the one who made sure the lights never ever went out. And he just fired me.
The reason was, on its face, laughably trivial. It was a sin of economy, an offense of pragmatism. I had booked him on a first-class commercial flight to Chicago for a keynote speech, not a private jet. His voice, a low and dangerous purr I knew better than my own heartbeat, came through the speaker of my desk phone. He was already in the airport lounge, his rage a palpable static on the line. He said, "Brielle, where is the G5?" I told him there wasn't one. The company jet was undergoing unscheduled maintenance in Teterboro, a fact he would have known if he ever read the fleet status reports I placed on his desk every Monday. The cost of chartering a comparable jet at such short notice would have been astronomical and fiscally irresponsible, a violation of the very shareholder value policies he loved to preach. So I made a decision. I booked him on the next available commercial flight, in the best seat money could buy, ensuring he'd still arrive with hours to spare. There was a long, cold silence on the phone, a silence I had learned to interpret as the gathering of a storm. Then he said the words. He called it a judgment lapse. He said that the CEO of Finch Global Asset Management does not fly with the public. It's not about comfort, Brielle. It's about optics. It's about the brand. Your judgment in this matter shows a fundamental misunderstanding of your role. I don't need a travel agent. I need an extension of my own will. Consider this your 2 weeks' notice. Pack your things. Security will escort you out. The line went dead. I sat there in the sterile silence of my glass-walled office, the phone receiver still cool against my ear. Below me the city hummed along, oblivious. 12 years. 12 years of missed birthdays, canceled vacations, and dinners that went cold. 12 years of anticipating his needs before he knew them himself, of deflecting his tempers, of cleaning up his messes, both professional and personal, all of it erased in 30 seconds because of a flight booking, a judgment lapse. I looked at the dual monitors on my desk. On the left was his official board-approved calendar, a clean, color-coded testament to a life of corporate responsibility, meetings with analysts, calls with the board, the keynote in Chicago. On the right was my other screen, the one that was password protected, triple encrypted, and air-gapped from the company's main network. This was the real calendar. The shadow ledger, I called it. This was the system that tracked the life Alistair actually lived. And as I stared at it, a quiet heat flushed up my neck. He had forgotten, in his fit of ego-driven pique, in his haste to discard me like a used paper cup, he had forgotten about his own judgment. The judgment that included a secret, off-the-books meeting in the Cayman Islands next Tuesday, a meeting with investors whose names would make our compliance department spontaneously combust. A meeting that, by a stroke of beautiful, terrible irony, was scheduled for the exact same day, at the exact same time, as his mandatory court-ordered deposition with the Securities and Exchange Commission. His judgment lapse was about to meet mine. I took a slow, deep breath. The shock was a high-frequency vibration under my skin, but on the surface, I was calm. I had always been calm. It was my primary job requirement. I minimized the shadow ledger and opened my email. I composed 2 new messages. My fingers moved with a precision and speed honed by more than a decade of service. The first was to Marcus Thorne, the notoriously bloodthirsty divorce lawyer representing Alistair's soon-to-be ex-wife, Genevieve. The subject line was simple: spousal asset disclosure addendum. The second email was to a name I had committed to memory years ago, a name Alistair himself had given me in a moment of panicked paranoia, lead investigator Kitteridge at the SEC's Enforcement Division. The subject line for that one was even simpler: potential scheduling conflict. To both emails I attached a single finalized and beautifully detailed travel itinerary, his trip to the Caymans, complete with flight numbers, hotel confirmations, and the contact information for the shell corporation that had booked it all. I hit send. Then I began to pack my things. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correcting a record. It was about a final, perfect act of administrative accuracy. He wanted me to be a human calendar. Fine. I just made sure everyone had the same schedule. The drive home was a blur. The city lights smeared across my windshield like wet paint. I kept the radio off, the silence in my car a hollow echo of the silence in my life that was about to begin. For 12 years my phone had been a relentless tyrant, buzzing and chiming at all hours with the ceaseless demands of Alistair Finch. Now it was dark, mute. I felt like an astronaut whose tether to the ship had just been cut, spinning silently into the void. The professional composure that had been my armor for over a decade began to crack, and by the time I pulled into the sterile underground garage of my apartment building, the facade had crumbled completely. I turned off the engine and just sat there in the dark, the concrete walls pressing in on me, and for the first time in a very long time, I let myself feel the full weight of the betrayal. A sob clawed its way up my throat, raw and ugly. It wasn't just about the job. It was about the years, the sheer volume of life I had poured into that man, into that company. It was a ghost limb, a phantom ache for a purpose that had been amputated without anesthetic. My mind, a traitorous archive, started playing the highlight reel of my own erasure. Flashbacks, sharp and painful as shards of glass. I was 28 when I started working for him. No, not for him. For his father, Arthur Finch, a man whose DNA Alistair had inherited, but whose character he had clearly rejected. Arthur was old school. He built the company on handshakes and integrity. He wore rumpled suits and his shoes were always scuffed. He remembered the names of the janitor's kids. He hired me himself, not as an assistant, but as a junior analyst. He saw something in my meticulous nature, my ability to see patterns in chaos. He told me, Brill, you don't just see the chessboard, you see the wood grain. That's rare. He was my mentor. He was the reason for my loyalty. Then Arthur got sick. A slow, cruel decline that took him piece by piece. Alistair, fresh from a stint at a rival firm where he'd made a name for himself with a series of aggressive, borderline unethical trades, was installed as his successor. The transition was a quiet coup. The first thing to go was the culture. The warm collegial atmosphere was replaced by a sterile high-gloss tension. Performance was no longer measured by results, but by optics. Alistair didn't care about the wood grain. He only cared about the polished surface of the board. I remember the day he officially took over. He called me into his new office, which was all chrome and black leather, a stark contrast to his father's warm, mahogany-filled study. He didn't offer me a seat. He paced, holding a file with my name on it. He said, "My father seemed to think you were some kind of prodigy. I don't see it. I see an analyst. We have plenty of those. What I don't have is someone to manage my life, to keep the noise out so I can focus on making money. From now on, you work for me directly. Your title is executive assistant." It was a demotion disguised as a promotion. A gilded cage. I was moved from the analyst floor to a glass box outside his office. My work shifted from dissecting market trends to dissecting his personal tastes, but I stayed. This is the part people won't understand. Why would you stay? It's the kind of question that gets debated in comment sections. Was it weakness? Was it a lack of ambition? No, it was loyalty. A misplaced, outdated loyalty to his father. I felt I owed it to Arthur to stay, to be the last bastion of his ethos, to keep the machinery he built from being completely stripped for parts by his own son. I thought I could be a moderating influence, a quiet voice of reason. I thought I could protect the company from him. What a fool I was. I wasn't a firewall protecting the company. I was just a shock absorber for his ego. My mind dredged up another memory, this one coated in the acidic bile of humiliation, the Omnicorp deal. About 5 years ago, it was our biggest acquisition attempt to date. Alistair was the front man, all swagger and billion-dollar smiles in the press, but behind the scenes he was fumbling. The deal was collapsing because he'd insulted the CEO of Omnicorp, a proud self-made man, by calling his company's technology quaint. The deal was hours from falling apart, taking our stock price with it. Alistair was in a full-blown panic, shouting at lawyers on a conference call. I was in my glass box, watching him implode. While he was screaming, I was working. I had spent weeks building a relationship with my counterpart at Omnicorp, a woman just like me, an executive assistant who was the true gatekeeper and nerve center of her organization. I knew her CEO's passions. He was an avid collector of antique maps. I spent 2 hours on the phone with a rare book dealer in London, and using my own credit card, I purchased a 17th century map of his hometown. I had it messengered to his hotel with a simple handwritten note, ostensibly from Alistair. The note didn't apologize. That would have been Alistair's way. Instead it read, "True value is often hidden in old maps and quaint technology. I'd be honored to help you navigate the future." The deal was back on within the hour. Alistair took all the credit. He called it a moment of inspired diplomacy. He never asked how the map got there. He never paid me back for it. My only reward was the continued existence of the company. At the time I told myself that was enough. And then there was the shadow ledger. That was the beginning of the real end. Though I didn't see it then. It started small. Alistair wanted a way to track certain expenses, certain contacts, that couldn't be on the corporate servers. He called it competitive intelligence, a slush fund for discreet political donations and off-the-record consultations. He tasked me with creating it. He said, "Brielle, I need a black box, something only you and I can access, something that leaves no footprints. I need you to be my ghost in the machine." I should have refused. I should have walked out then. But my loyalty, that stubborn, stupid vine, was still wrapped around Arthur Finch's memory. And there was another, more pragmatic reason: fear. By then I knew what Alistair was capable of. A quiet threat, a ruined reputation. So I built it. And that's how I met Anya Sharma. This is the subplot that matters. This is the part of the story that isn't just about me. Anya was a senior network architect in our IT department. She was brilliant, cynical,
and saw through the corporate nonsense with a clarity that was both refreshing and terrifying. When I started building the specifications for Alistair's black box, I had to bring her in. I couldn't build something that was truly invisible to the company's network without the person who designed that network. I booked a meeting with her in a drab, windowless conference room, the kind reserved for conversations that no one wanted to have. I was vague, speaking in corporate euphemisms about a highly confidential executive project requiring a segregated data environment. Anya listened, her dark eyes unblinking. She let me talk for 10 minutes, then held up a hand. She said, "You can stop. You need a digital ghost, a place to hide the bodies." For him, she jerked her head in the direction of Alistair's office. I was stunned into silence. She just smiled. A thin, humorless smile. "Brielle, I've been here 7 years. I know who signs the checks, and I know who cashes them. You're the one who actually makes the trains run. He's just the guy who sells the tickets. If you need this built, I'll help you. But not for him, for you." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Because one day, a man like that will decide the train is running too well on its own, and he'll throw the conductor under the wheels just to feel the bump. You need your own key to this box. A dead man's switch, a way out." We became quiet co-conspirators. She was the only other person in that entire company of 5,000 souls who knew the truth about my role. We would have project meetings that were really just therapy sessions over the hiss of the bad office coffee machine. She'd tell me about the ludicrous security requests from the C-suite, and I'd tell her about Alistair's latest tantrum. It was Anya who designed the architecture for the shadow ledger. She built it with a master key, a cryptographic backdoor that only my personal, non-company devices could access. She taught me how to use it. She said, "Think of it as an insurance policy. You hope you never need it, but you sleep better knowing it's there." Sitting in my car in that dark garage, the full weight of Anya's foresight hit me. He threw the conductor under the wheels, just to feel the bump. That was it. That was the moment. The catalyst. The point where the grief and the shock, and the 12 years of corrosive loyalty finally burned away, leaving behind something cold, hard, and clear as diamond. The self-pity evaporated, replaced by a glacial calm. My breathing steadied. My hands, which had been trembling on the steering wheel, became still. It wasn't about revenge. I kept telling myself that. It was about balance. It was about a debt being called in. Alistair Finch had used me as a tool for 12 years. A tool to build his empire. A tool to clean his messes. A tool to hide his secrets. And when he was done, he'd discarded me. But he made one critical mistake. He forgot that the tool he'd discarded was the same one that had built the master lock. And I still had the key. I finally got out of the car and walked to the elevator, my heels clicking with a newfound purpose on the cold concrete. The tears were gone. The despair was gone. In their place was a quiet, focused resolve. Alistair saw me as a human calendar, an object. He was about to find out that a calendar doesn't just tell you where you're supposed to be. It also keeps a perfect, unchangeable record of where you've been. And his record was about to be made very, very public. I got into my apartment, locked the door, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I poured myself a glass of wine, not to drown my sorrows, but to toast a new beginning, the beginning of his end. My phone was still silent, a beautiful, promising silence. The void didn't feel so scary anymore. It felt like an opportunity. It felt like clean air. Back in my apartment, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation, I didn't waste any more time on emotion. The window for grief had closed. Now it was time for architecture. The architecture of a consequence. I walked past my living room, with its comfortable couch and sad, wilting plant I always forgot to water, and went straight to my home office. It was a small spare room, a testament to a life lived mostly elsewhere. On the desk sat my personal laptop, a sleek matte black machine that had no connection, no history, No digital entanglement with Finch Global Asset Management. It was my clean slate. I turned it on, the screen glowed to life, and I felt that familiar, comforting hum of a system responding to my command. This was my real office. This was my real domain. My first move was to access the shadow ledger, not through the front door Alistair had used, but through the back door Anya had built for me. It required a two-factor authentication that was beautifully, poetically analog. The first was a standard, complex password. The second was a specific 64-character string hidden in the source code of a photo on my hard drive. It was a picture of me and Arthur Finch, taken at a company picnic a decade ago. He had his arm around my shoulder, a genuine crinkle-eyed smile on his face. He looked proud. Anya had suggested it. She'd called it the ghost's password. Once inside, the ledger bloomed on my screen. It wasn't a calendar. Not really. That was just its skin. In truth, it was a meticulously cross-referenced database of Alistair's entire secret life. It was a masterpiece of paranoia, built to his exact specifications, and now it was my weapon. I want you to understand the sheer comprehensive detail of what I had built for him. It wasn't just dates and times. Every entry was a node connected to a web of information. The Cayman Islands meeting, for example, wasn't just a line item. Clicking on it revealed everything. The encrypted chat logs with the offshore investors, using coded language we had developed together. Discussing the weather meant a wire transfer. Checking on the kids was a query about Shell Corporation readiness. It contained the flight manifests for the private jet he thought he would be taking, booked under a holding company. Aeolus Solutions, a little joke of mine he never got. It had scans of the falsified travel authorizations he'd instructed me to create, which would show him as being on a personal health retreat in Arizona, a perfect alibi for his official calendar. It had the wire transfer confirmations for the facilitation fees paid to the local financial agents in Grand Cayman, sent from a bank account that didn't bear his name, but which I could prove he controlled. It was a perfect self-contained universe of his corruption, and I had the map. This is where my foresight, the very quality Arthur Finch had prized in me, came into play. For years I had operated on a principle of quiet preparedness. I hadn't been plotting revenge. That's a narrative for simpler stories. I had been building a parachute. Every time Alistair asked me to do something that felt ethically gray, every time he casually ordered me to handle a situation that skirted the edges of the law, I documented it. Not on the company servers, but here, in a separate partitioned section of the ledger I called the contingency file. I saved every email, every text message, every scanned napkin on which he'd scribbled a questionable instruction. I did this not out of malice, but out of a primal instinct for self-preservation. I knew with the certainty of a sailor watching the barometer drop that a storm was coming eventually. I just never knew what form it would take. My alliance with Anya was the second pillar of my plan. She wasn't just my moral support. She was my technical enabler. We had a protocol established years ago. If I ever went dark, if I was fired or worse, a simple coded text message from my personal phone to hers would trigger a series of events. The code was innocuous. Did you get the files for the quarterly review? If she received that text, she was to immediately initiate what we called the porcelain protocol. First, she would run a program that would scrub every trace of my user activity from the company's systems for the last 72 hours, making it impossible for them to build a case that I had stolen data on my way out. Second, she would change the master password to the front end of the shadow ledger, locking Alistair out of his own secret world. Third, and most crucially, she would create a digital smokescreen, a series of ghost inquiries and false access attempts on the server logs that would point to a sophisticated external hack. It would send their IT security team on a wild goose chase, looking for a phantom Russian hacker instead of the fired assistant who was sitting in her apartment a few miles away. It was a beautiful piece of digital misdirection. After I was escorted out of the building, the first thing I did when I got to my car was send that text. Anya simply replied, received. Will review and revert. I knew the silent takeover of the digital realm was already complete. The third pillar was my legal preparation. About 3 years ago, after a particularly nasty incident where Alistair had me disappear, a paper trail related to a failed venture that cost a number of small investors their savings, I knew I had crossed a line. My complicity was no longer passive. That night I couldn't sleep. I went online and researched corporate lawyers. I didn't want a bulldog from a massive firm. I wanted someone small, sharp, and discreet. I found her in a boutique practice downtown. Her name was Evelyn Reed. Her firm's motto was, "We don't get loud, we get results." I paid for a 2-hour consultation with my own money. I laid out a hypothetical situation that was a thinly veiled version of my reality. I asked her how a person in that situation could protect themselves. Evelyn didn't pass judgment. She just listened, her pen making small, precise notes on a legal pad. When I was finished, she looked at me and said, "The person in your hypothetical situation is currently an unindicted co-conspirator. Their loyalty is a liability. Their only leverage is the quality of their documentation and the preservation of chain of custody. They need to build a case file as if they were their own prosecutor. Every document needs to be authenticated, every communication time-stamped, and everything needs to be stored off-site and inaccessible to their employer." And she added, her eyes locking onto mine, "They need to have a lawyer on retainer." I hired her that day. For the past 3 years, on the first of every month, I had sent her a small retainer fee, and every quarter I would deliver a password-protected hard drive to her office containing a full encrypted backup of the contingency file. My actions today weren't just the impulsive rage of a scorned employee. They were the activation of a carefully constructed, legally sound 3-year-old plan. Now it was time to deploy. I opened my email client again. The 2 messages I had sent from my work account were just the appetizer. They were the warning shot. The main course would be served from here, from my personal untraceable command center. I spent a full hour drafting the real emails, the ones with the attachments. For Marcus Thorne, the divorce lawyer, I curated a specific subset of the ledger's data. I focused on financial infidelity. I attached spreadsheets detailing the flow of money into the offshore account, records of extravagant gifts, jewelry, a condo in Aspen for a woman who was not his wife, and travel itineraries for romantic getaways disguised as business trips. I wrote a simple, direct cover letter. "Mr. Thorne, in the interest of a full and fair disclosure for the Finch divorce proceedings, I am providing these documents which I believe were inadvertently omitted from the initial discovery. I was Mr. Finch's executive assistant for 12 years and can attest to their authenticity. I am, of course, willing to testify to this under oath. Sincerely, Brielle." I knew that for a lawyer like Thorne, this wasn't just a file. It was a tactical nuke. For investigator Kitteridge at the SEC, I prepared a different but equally devastating package. This one focused on securities fraud, market manipulation, and violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I attached the chat logs with the Cayman investors, the evidence of the slush fund, and the internal memos, written by Alistair, that outlined his intention to use insider information to short a competitor's stock. I highlighted the upcoming meeting, presenting it not as a potential scheduling conflict, but as an active attempt to circumvent his deposition and engage in activities that were the very subject of their investigation. My cover letter was even more sterile. Investigator Kitteridge, I was recently terminated from my position as executive assistant to Alistair Finch. As part of my duties, I was responsible for maintaining certain records which may be material to your ongoing investigation. These are attached. I believe Mr. Finch is traveling to the Cayman Islands on Tuesday for a meeting that directly conflicts with his scheduled deposition. The attached itinerary is confirmed. I am available to provide context for these documents at your convenience. Sincerely, Brielle. I read both emails one last time. My finger hovered over the mouse. This was the moment of no return. The precipice. 12 years of my life had led to this single click. It wasn't about revenge. I said it again, a mantra to steady my hand. It was about truth. It was about restoring a sense of order to a universe that Alistair had so thoroughly corrupted. He had used his power to create a secret world built on lies. I was simply turning on the lights. With a final steadying breath, I clicked send, and as the progress bar flashed and disappeared, I felt a profound sense of peace. The game was on, the board was set, and for the first time I wasn't just a pawn. I was a player. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the hollow, empty silence of being disconnected. It was the quiet, humming silence of a machine that has been set in motion, a bomb that has been armed and is now ticking. I didn't have to wait long. About 2 hours later, just as the sun was beginning to stain the sky a bruised purple, my personal phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. The message was short. "This is Marcus Thorne. I'll take a triple shot of whatever you're drinking. My office, tomorrow, 9 a.m. Don't be late." A grim smile touched my lips. The first piece was in play. The silent takeover had begun. The next morning, the world felt different, sharper. The air in my apartment seemed cleaner, the coffee tasted richer. The absence of the constant low-grade anxiety I had lived with for years was a physical sensation, like a heavy coat I hadn't realized I was wearing had finally been taken off. I dressed with purpose, not in the subdued, conservative attire of an executive assistant designed to blend into the background, but in a tailored navy blue suit that I had bought for a special occasion and never had the chance to wear. It was my armor. At precisely 9 a.m., I walked into the polished mahogany and leather offices of Thorne and Associates. The receptionist, a woman with a severe haircut and an even more severe expression, showed me directly into Marcus Thorne's office. He was a man who looked exactly like his reputation, sharp, expensive, and radiating a predatory intelligence. He was on the phone, his back to me, looking out at the panoramic view of the city. He waved me into a chair without turning around. He said into the phone, "No, you listen to me. You will file the emergency motion to freeze all known assets, domestic and international, by noon. Cite the new evidence of undisclosed offshore accounts and material misrepresentation, and get a process server to the airport. I want him served with the temporary restraining order the second he steps off that plane from Chicago." He listened for a moment, then laughed, a dry, humorless bark. "He doesn't have the jet anymore. Oh, this just keeps getting better, just do it." He hung up and finally turned to face me. He didn't offer me coffee. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He gestured to the printed out files on his desk, the ones I had sent him. He said, "For 12 years you were his shadow. You knew where every skeleton was because you were the one who handed him the shovel. Why now, Braille? Why turn on him after all this time?" I met his gaze without flinching. I said, "He called it a judgment lapse. I'm just showing him what one really looks like." Thorne studied me for a long moment, a slight, appreciative smile playing on his lips. He leaned back in his chair. "Genevieve Finch is about to become a very, very wealthy woman, and you, Brielle, are about to become her favorite person in the world. What do you want?" I hadn't expected the question. I told myself this wasn't about personal gain. But sitting there in that seat of power, I realized that was only half true. It wasn't about a payday, but it was about value. My value. I said, "I want a consulting contract. My expertise is in administrative architecture and logistical strategy. I built his operational life from the ground up. I can do the same for your high net worth clients who need their chaotic lives organized and optimized." Thorne raised an eyebrow. "You want me to hire you as a professional fixer?" I said, "I want you to connect me with the people who need one. You have a client list full of people who are either a
or divorcing a mess. I'm the one who cleans up the mess, for a fee." He nodded slowly, a look of dawning respect in his eyes. He said, "I like it. It's clean. It's direct. You're not looking for a handout. You're monetizing your experience." He picked up his pen. "Let's draw up an agreement." While I was laying the groundwork for my new life, the panic was beginning to ripple through my old one. I got the play-by-play from Anya in a series of discreet, encrypted messages. Her first message came while I was in the elevator leaving Thorne's office. It read, "Phase 2 complete. The bear is poking the hive. This meant Alistair was back from Chicago and had tried to log into the Shadow Ledger. He was locked out. Her next message arrived an hour later. He's on a rampage. Wants to know who changed his access credentials. It is in full meltdown. Our Russian phantom is getting the blame. They're locking down the network. It's adorable. I could almost hear her dry sarcasm through the screen. Alistair, deprived of his digital crutch, was flying blind. The ledger wasn't just for his illicit dealings, it was for everything. It contained the private phone numbers of his real allies, the passcodes to his personal bank accounts, the complex web of reminders and follow-ups that allowed him to feign omniscience. Without it, he was just a man in an expensive suit with a bad temper. Anya described the scene. Alistair, storming through the IT department, his face a mask of purple fury, demanding they find his data. He was shouting my name. Where is Brielle? Get her on the phone. But HR had already deactivated my numbers, my access, my entire corporate existence, just as he had ordered. He had fired the one person who could solve his problem. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The first external shockwave hit that afternoon. A reporter from a major financial news outlet published a short, explosive article online. The headline was Finch Global CEO, Alistair Finch named in emergency asset freeze amid contentious divorce. The article was light on details but heavy on insinuation. It mentioned newly discovered evidence of undisclosed offshore entities and a sudden unexpected travel conflict with an upcoming SEC deposition. It didn't mention the Cayman Islands by name. It didn't have to. The damage was done. The stock price for Finch Global, which had been stable all morning, began to quiver. Anya's next message was frantic. Board members are calling. The general counsel is having a stroke in his office. Alistair is screaming that you're a corporate terrorist. He's demanding we file a lawsuit. I messaged back. Let him. My lawyer is waiting. I knew Evelyn Reed's preparation would make any lawsuit dead on arrival. They would have to prove I stole company data. But Porcelain Protocol had wiped my tracks, and the data itself wasn't on their servers. More importantly, to sue me, they'd have to admit in a court of law that the Shadow Ledger existed, and they would have to describe what was in it. It was a perfect stalemate. They couldn't attack me without revealing the very secrets they wanted to hide. It was a beautiful, elegant trap. Then came the call I was waiting for, Investigator Kitteridge from the SEC. His voice was calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. He didn't thank me. He didn't ask about my motives. He just got straight to the point. He said, Miss Brielle, we have received your correspondence. We can confirm that Mr. Finch's deposition for next Tuesday is in fact mandatory. Failure to appear will result in a warrant being issued for his arrest. Is there anything else you think we should know? I told him about the alibi, the personal health retreat in Arizona. I explained how it was designed to give him plausible deniability. I could hear him typing in the background. He said, "Thank you for the clarification. That is very helpful." Then he hung up. He hadn't confirmed that he would act on the information, but the subtext was clear. The SEC now had a roadmap to Alistair's deception. They knew not only where he was going, but how he was planning to lie about it. The final piece of the initial takedown fell into place late that afternoon. My personal phone rang. The caller ID showed a name that made my heart give a little leap. Julian Croft. He was the CEO of our largest institutional client, a pension fund worth tens of billions of dollars. Julian was a sharp, no-nonsense man who, like Arthur Finch, valued competence over charm. He had always dealt with me directly on logistical matters, often bypassing Alistair, a fact that always infuriated my former boss. Julian's voice was grim. He said, "Brielle, what the hell is going on over there? I just read the news. Alistair isn't answering his phone." I gave him the carefully prepared, legally vetted answer. I said, "Julian, my employment with Finch Global was terminated yesterday. I can't speak to their internal affairs." There was a long pause on the other end. Then Julian said, "Terminated? They fired you. Are they insane? You're the only one over there who knows how to get anything done. He sighed, a sound of pure frustration. This explains everything. The chaos, the lack of communication. Look, I don't care about Alistair's messy divorce, but I do care about stability and competence. The two things that just walked out the door. Where did you land? It was the opening I had been waiting for. I said I'm starting my own strategic consultancy, specializing in executive logistics and administrative architecture. I heard him chuckle. Of course you are. Wasting no time. Good. Listen, I'm pulling our fund from Finch. The board will ratify it in the morning. It's a clear violation of our key man clause. You were the key man, Brielle, whether they knew it or not. Send me the paperwork for your new firm. We'll be your first client. I hung up the phone, my hand trembling slightly. This was it. This was the tipping point. It wasn't just about embarrassing Alistair or giving his wife leverage. This was about the fundamental truth of the business world. Capital follows competence. Alistair thought the clients were loyal to his brand, to his name on the door. He was wrong. They were loyal to the seamless, frictionless, profitable experience I had created for them. I was the asset. He was just the overhead. The silent takeover was no longer silent. The ground was crumbling under his feet, and he was too busy looking for a ghost in the machine to notice the earthquake. The next few days were a blur of controlled, strategic chaos. The news of Julian Croft's pension fund pulling out of Finch Global hit the markets like a sledgehammer. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a public filing. The stock, which had been trembling, went into a nosedive. The story was no longer just about a messy divorce. It was about a catastrophic loss of confidence from their single largest client. The financial news outlets were in a frenzy, and the narrative was clear. The ship was sinking. My role in this was one of active strategic silence. I didn't leak anything more. I didn't need to. I had lit the fuse, and now I was simply watching the fire spread. My days were spent in Evelyn Reed's borrowed conference room, hammering out the legal framework for my new company, Solon Strategies. The name was Evelyn's idea. Solon was the ancient Athenian statesman who reformed the law to prevent economic and political collapse. It was a perfect fit. While Finch Global was imploding, I was building. Anya was my lifeline, my periscope into the wreckage. Her messages painted a vivid picture of a company in its death throes. The board was in emergency session. Lawyers were crawling all over the building. Alistair, she reported, was a ghost in his own office, pale and jittery, making frantic calls to allies who were suddenly in meetings or traveling. He had become toxic. The brand he was so obsessed with was now an anchor, dragging him to the bottom. The exodus began in earnest. Julian Croft's departure had broken the dam. Two more major clients, spooked by the instability and their inability to get a straight answer from anyone at the firm, announced they were putting their contracts under review. They didn't call Alistair. They called Marcus Thorne, the divorce lawyer, asking if he knew how to get in touch with that brilliant assistant Brielle. Thorne, who was now acting as my de facto agent, fielded the calls with gleeful efficiency. My dance card for the next month was full before my company even had a logo. The power shift was palpable. It was a quiet, orderly migration of capital, moving from the noise and panic of Finch Global to the calm, steady promise of Solon Strategies. Then came Alistair's desperate countermove. It was late on Friday afternoon. I was packing up my briefcase when my personal phone rang. It was an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it, but a gut feeling told me I should. I was right. It was him. His voice was completely different. The arrogant, commanding purr was gone, replaced by a strained, wheedling tone I had never heard before. He said, "Brielle, thank God, I've been trying to reach you. Listen, there's been a terrible misunderstanding. A terrible, terrible mistake. I was under a lot of pressure. The Chicago trip, it was stressful. I wasn't myself. I remained silent. I let him talk, let him fill the void with his desperation. He went on, his words tumbling over each other. This is all just a misunderstanding that spiraled out of control.
The board is there panicking. We need you back. We need you to fix this. Name your price, a new title. Vice President of Operations, Executive Vice President. Whatever you want. A raise, double your salary. Triple it. Just tell me what you need to make this right. Tell me how to call off the dogs. I listened to his pathetic groveling, and I felt nothing. No pity, no anger, not even satisfaction. It was like listening to a weather report from a distant country. It simply didn't affect me. When he finally ran out of breath, I spoke. My voice was calm and even. I said, Alistair, there is no price, there is no misunderstanding. You made a decision based on your judgment. Now you're seeing the consequences. He started to stammer, to plead. Brielle, please, you can't do this. The company, my father's company, that was his final mistake. Invoking his father's name, a quiet heat rose in my chest. I said, don't you dare talk to me about your father. Your father built a company based on integrity. You turned it into a shell game. You fired me for booking a commercial flight, calling it a lapse in judgment. Meanwhile, you were preparing to commit fraud and lie to federal investigators. So let's talk about judgment, Alistair. Whose exactly has lapsed? He was silent. For the first time, he had no answer. I said, goodbye, Alistair, and I hung up. I blocked his number. The power shift was complete. It wasn't just that the clients had left him. It was that he had tried to buy me back, and discovered to his horror that I was no longer for sale. I had never been. My loyalty had been to an idea, an ideal his father had represented. And when he had extinguished that ideal, my loyalty had simply evaporated. He had nothing left to offer me. The final act played out not with a bang, but with a series of quiet, inevitable clicks. The Tuesday of the deposition arrived. I spent the day in my new, still sparse office, a small but bright space, overlooking a park. I was on the phone with my first official client, walking them through a logistical overhaul of their family office. It was challenging, rewarding work. I was building something again, but this time I was building it for myself. Around 3 p.m., an email dinged in my inbox. It was from Anya. The subject line was a single word, done. The body of the email was a link to a press release that had just gone live on the financial newswires. Finch Global Asset Management announces CEO transition. Alistair Finch to step down, effective immediately. The board had finally cut him loose. The article was a masterpiece of corporate spin, talking about new leadership for a new era, and thanking Alistair for his years of service. It mentioned that he was leaving to pursue other opportunities and focus on personal matters. I knew personal matters was code for a mountain of legal trouble. He had, of course, failed to show up for his SEC deposition. A warrant was likely already on its way. He hadn't gone to the Cayman Islands either. Marcus Thorne's process server had seen to that, serving him with the asset freeze and a court order restricting his travel the moment he'd stepped off the jetway from Chicago. He was trapped. A king checkmated on a board of his own design. A week later, I had the final confrontation I didn't even know I needed. I was having lunch with Julian Croft at a restaurant downtown, finalizing the terms of our engagement. As we were leaving, I saw him. Alistair. He was sitting alone at the bar, staring into a glass of whiskey. He looked diminished. His expensive suit was rumpled. His face was pale and puffy. The aura of power and menace that had once surrounded him was gone. He was just a man. He saw me, and his eyes widened. A flicker of the old anger mixed with a new, raw fear. He stood up and took a step towards me. Julian put a protective hand on my arm, but I shook my head slightly. It was okay. Alistair stopped a few feet away. He looked from me to Julian, a man who had once been his biggest client, now my lunch companion. The realization of what had happened, the sheer totality of his defeat, seemed to wash over him in that moment. His shoulders slumped. He opened his mouth, then closed it. What was there to say? He looked at me, his eyes pleading. Why, Brielle, he finally whispered, the word barely audible. I looked at him, not with hatred, but with a kind of detached pity. I thought of all the years, all the sacrifice, all the quiet humiliations. I thought of the man his father had been, and I gave him the only answer that mattered. It was never about revenge, Alistair, I said, my voice quiet but clear enough for him to hear. It was about a judgment lapse. You just made the wrong one. I turned and walked away, Julian by my side. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew what was behind me, a ruin of a man, a ghost in a fallen empire. Ahead of me was my new reality, a clean, well-lit office, a roster of clients who valued my competence, a future I was building on my own terms. The lights in my world were bright now, and I was the one who controlled the switch. In my new office, on a clean white wall, hangs a single framed document. It's the commercial flight itinerary to Chicago, the one that got me fired. To anyone else, it's just a piece of paper, a relic of a forgotten business trip. But to me, it's a symbol. It's the receipt for my freedom. It's a reminder that sometimes your greatest perceived failure is actually the key that unlocks the door to your real life. It's the proof that my judgment was sound, not because it was what my boss wanted, but because it was right. And in the end, the truth is a much more powerful asset than a private jet. My name is Brielle, and I was an executive assistant, but that was my title, not my identity. My identity was the architect, the strategist, the fixer. For 12 years, I lent that identity to someone else. He didn't value it, so he lost it. This story isn't unique to me. Maybe you're a project manager whose boss takes all the credit. Maybe you're a software engineer who builds the code that makes your VP look like a genius. Maybe you're a paralegal who catches the mistake that saves the whole case, only to get a condescending pat on the head. We are the architects. We are the ones who see the wood grain, not just the polished surface. We are the ones holding it all together, often in silence, often without recognition. So I want to speak directly to you. Your value is not determined by the title someone else gives you. It is inherent in the work you do, in the problems you solve, in the integrity you bring to your tasks. Don't ever let anyone, no matter how powerful, make you feel like a utility. You are not a human calendar. You are not an external hard drive. You are the asset. It wasn't about revenge for me. It was about reclamation. It was about taking my name, my skills, and my future back. It was about building my own table, instead of waiting for a seat at a broken one. Your story might be different. Your circumstances are your own, but the principle is the same. Know your value. Document your contributions. Build your alliances, and never ever be afraid to make a judgment call that you know is right, even if it costs you a job. Because sometimes losing a job is the only way to find your real work. Thank you for listening to my story. It means the world to know that there are other people out there who get it. If this resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the invisible architect in someone else's success story, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. Leave a comment below, and tell me about a time you knew your judgment was right, even when no one else did. Let's share our stories. Let's build a community of architects, because together we are not invisible, and we are not alone. Thank you.